So we're back for the second part of the trunking configuration lab. We have verified that the switch ports are in the correct VLANs on both switches. Now let's set up that pesky trunk between the two and lock down which VLANs can go across it. Now I'm going to set this up on the 2950 end first, and as soon as I set it up on the 2950 end, since the 2960 is set to auto, it will automatically negotiate a VLAN trunk on the port that I configure, and everything will actually start working at that point, and we'll show you that that happens in pretty much real time. However, we will go and configure the same configuration settings on the remote end, just for consistency's sake, because again, not only are you looking at this video for exam prep, but also to see what happens in the real world when you set this up and some of the best practices. So let's go into our 2950, config T. We'll do interface fast Ethernet 0/47 because I know that 47 and 48 are pointed at the 2960 switch. So we'll go onto the switch. We'll say switch port mode. We have options for access, dynamic, and trunk. Again, if you go dynamic, that's where you get the auto and desirable options. In this case, I don't want it to be dynamic. I want to specify that this port is a trunk port, and there aren't any other options besides switch port mode trunk. So we do that, and you see that it brings the line protocol down and brings it back up. If we go over to the 2960 and we do show interface trunk, we see that we actually have a trunk now at this point, and it's allowing all VLANs across the trunk, and it sees that VLANs 1 and 30 are active on both ends of the link, and so that's going to configure port 47 as a trunk for those two VLANs. Let's go and configure port 48, because that's the other port that's pointing at the 2960. You see that the line protocol goes down, comes back up. If we go on this end and we do show interface trunk, we now have two trunk links, both allowing VLANs 1 and 30 across it. While we're on the 2960, let's go ahead and configure both of those. In this case, I'll do interface range fast Ethernet 0/47 to 48 and configure both of those interfaces at the same time. So we'll do switch port mode trunk. I'll go ahead and write the config. And because those ports were already trunking, it's not going to tear them down and bring them back up as a trunk port. That's something else to remember when you're configuring trunk ports in live configurations. I could go into these configurations right now and do switch port mode access on both of these ports, and the trunk would stay active because it only negotiates the trunk when the interface comes back up. That's why when we switched it from access mode to trunk mode on the 2950, it had to bring the interface down and back up so that it could renegotiate that trunking protocol. So now that we have our trunk up and running, let's go try to ping from our virtual machine over to our physical. And look at that, we now have pings coming right from 10.10.10.5, which is the address on this physical interface over here. So at this point, the trunk is up and working. However, we're going to explore a couple of more commands in the trunking configuration. And these are more for security than they are functionality, but we'll look at them anyway. If you're in interface configuration mode and you do switch port trunk, you can set certain VLANs to be allowed across the trunk. And again, this is used for security. This is used for spanning tree configuration when you get into some of the more advanced spanning tree options. But in our case, we'll say allowed, and then we can say allowed VLAN. I don't know why it even makes you type in the word if it's the only option you can have there, but they have their reasons. And by default, the all keyword is what's active on all of your trunk ports. So you can go into this guy and you can say trunk allowed VLAN none, and it would not allow any VLANs to trunk across this trunk port, which would kind of negate the point of having a trunk port. You could say remove VLAN 50 from this list. So we'll actually do that. Switch port trunk allowed VLAN remove 50. So now if we go back and we do show interface trunk, we see VLANs allowed on trunk fast Ethernet 048, 1 through 49, 51 through 4094. We have specifically excluded VLAN 50 from being allowed across fast Ethernet 048. Now, one thing to be careful of here is unless you specify the words add or remove, any VLANs you put on that line will be the only VLANs that are allowed. For example, let's say you have switch port trunk allow VLAN 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. and you say, oh, I need to go in there and allow 9 and 10 as well. So you go back into the interface and you do switch port trunk allowed VLAN 9. Unless you specify add, it's going to overwrite that entire list of VLANs with just VLAN 9, which means whatever other devices were in those other VLANs now have no way of leaving that switch. They probably can't get to their default gateway. They probably can't get to any servers or anything else that's on any of the other switches. You've effectively broken your network. And so that's got pretty much everything covered when it comes to VLAN trunking, at least at the CCNA level. And this concludes our discussion of VLAN trunking.